Chapter 7. Steps were heard at the door, and Princess Betsy, knowing it was Madame Karenina, glanced at Vronsky. He was looking towards the door, and his face wore a strange new expression. Joyfully, intently, and at the same time timidly, he gazed at the approaching figure, and slowly he rose to his feet. Anna walked into the drawing-room, holding herself extremely erect as always, looking straight before her, and moving with her swift, resolute, and light step that distinguished her from all other society women. She crossed the short space to her hostess, shook hands with her, smiled, and with the same smile looked around at Vronsky. Vronsky bowed low and pushed a chair up for her. She acknowledged this only by a slight nod, flushed a little, and frowned. But immediately, while rapidly greeting her acquaintances and shaking the hands proffered to her, she addressed Princess Betsy. "I have been at Countess Lydia's, and I meant to come here earlier, but I stayed on. Sir John was there. He's very interesting." "Oh, that's the missionary?" "Yes, he told us about life in India. Most interesting things." The conversation, interrupted by her coming in, flickered up again like the light of a lamp being blown out. "Sir John, yes, Sir John, I've seen him. He speaks well. The Vlasieva girl's quite in love with him." "And is it true that the younger Vlasieva girl's to marry Topov?" "Yes, they say that's a settled thing." "I wonder at the parents. They say it's a marriage for love." "For love? What antediluvian notions you have. Can one talk of love in these days?" said the ambassador's wife. "What's to be done? It's a foolish old fashion that's kept up still," said Vronsky. "So much the worse for those who keep up the fashion. The only happy marriages I know are marriages of prudence." "Yes, but then how often the happiness of these prudent marriages flies away like dust just because that passion turns up that they have refused to recognize," said Vronsky. "But by marriages of prudence we mean those in which both parties have sown their wild oats already. That's like scarlatina. One has to go through it and get it over with." "Well then, the solution is they ought to find out how to vaccinate for love like they do for smallpox." "I was in love in my young days with a deacon," said the Princess Markaya. "I don't know that it did me any good." "No, I imagine, joking aside, that to know love one must make mistakes and then correct them," said Princess Betsy. "Even after marriage," said the ambassador's wife playfully. "It's never too late to mend," the attaché repeated the English proverb. "Just so," Betsy agreed. "One must make mistakes and correct them. What do you think about it?" She turned to Anna, who with a faintly perceptible resolute smile on her lips was listening in silence to the conversation. "I think," said Anna, playing with the glove she had taken off, "I think of so many men, so many minds, certainly so many hearts, so many kinds of love." Vronsky was gazing at Anna, and with a fainting heart waiting for what she would say. He sighed as if after a danger escaped when she uttered these words. Anna suddenly turned to him. "Oh, I have had a letter from Moscow. They write me that Kitty Shtcherbatskaya's very ill." "Really?" said Vronsky, knitting his brows. Anna looked sternly at him. that doesn't interest you?" "On the contrary, it does very much. What was it exactly they told you, if I may know?" he asked. Anna got up and went to Betsy. "Give me a cup of tea," she said, standing at her table. While Betsy was pouring out the tea, Vronsky went up to Anna. "What is it they write to you?" he repeated. "I often think men have no understanding of what's not honorable, though they're always talking of it," said Anna. "I've wanted to tell you so a long while," she added, and moving a few steps away, she sat down at a table in a corner covered with albums. "I don't quite understand the meaning of your words," he said, handing her the cup. She glanced towards the sofa beside her, and he instantly sat down. "Yes, I've been wanting to tell you," she said, not looking at him. "You behaved wrongly, very wrongly." "Do you suppose I don't know that I've acted wrongly? But who was the cause of my doing so?" "What do you say that to me for?" she said, glancing severely at him. "You know what for," he answered boldly and joyfully, meeting her glance. Not he, but she was confused. "That only shows you have no heart," she said. But her eyes said that she knew he had a heart, and that was why she was afraid of him. "What you just spoke of now was a mistake, and not love. Remember, I have forbidden you to utter that word, that hateful word," said Anna with a shudder. But at once she felt that by that very word, forbidden, she had shown that she acknowledged certain rights over him, and by that very fact was encouraging him to speak of love. "I have long meant to tell you this," she went on, looking resolutely into his eyes, and hot all over from the burning flush on her cheeks. "I've come on purpose this evening, knowing I should meet you. I have come to tell you this must end. I have never blushed before anyone, and you force me to feel blame for something." He looked at her, and he was struck by a new spiritual beauty in her face. "What do you wish of me?" he said simply and seriously. "I want you to go to Moscow and ask for Kitty's forgiveness," she said. "You don't wish that," he said. He saw she was saying what she forced herself to say, not what she wanted to say. "If you love me, as you say," she whispered, "do so that I may be at peace." His face grew radiant. "Don't you know that you're all my life to me? But I know no peace, and I can't give it to you. All myself and love, yes. I can't think of you and myself apart. You and I are one to me, and I see no chance before us of peace for me or for you. I see a chance of despair, of wretchedness, or I see a chance of bliss. What bliss? Can it be there's no chance of it?" he murmured with his lips, but she heard. She strained every effort of her mind to say what ought to be said, but instead of that she let her eyes rest on him, full of love, and made no answer. "It's come," he thought in ecstasy, "when I was beginning to despair, and it seemed there would be no end. It's come. She loves me. She owns it." "Then do this for me. Never say such things to me, and let us be friends," she said in words, but her eyes spoke quite differently. Friends we shall never be. You know that yourself. Whether we shall be the happiest or the most wretched of people, that is in your hands." She would have said something, but he interrupted her. "I ask one thing only. I ask for the right to hope, to suffer as I do. But if even that cannot be, command me to disappear, and I disappear. You shall not see me if my presence is distasteful to you." "I don't want to drive you away." "Only don't change anything. Leave everything as it is," he said in a shaky voice. "Here's your husband." At that instant, Alexey Alexandrovitch did in fact walk into the room with his calm, awkward gait. Glancing at his wife and Vronsky, he went up to the lady of the house and, sitting down for a cup of tea, began talking in his deliberate, always audible voice, in his habitual tone of banter, ridiculing someone. "Your Rambouillet is in full conclave," he said, looking round at all the party. "The Graces and the Muses." Princess Betsy could not endure that tone of his, sneering she called it, using the English word, and like a skillful hostess she at once brought him into a serious conversation on the subject of universal conscription. Alexey Alexandrovitch was immediately interested in the subject, and began seriously defending the new imperial decree against Princess Betsy, who had attacked it. Vronsky and Anna still sat at the little table. "This is getting indecorous," whispered one lady with an expressive glance at Madame Karenina, Vronsky, and her husband. "What did I tell you?" said Anna's friend. But not only those ladies, almost everyone in the room, even the Princess Makaya and Betsy herself, looked several times in the direction of the two who had withdrawn from the general circle, as though that were a disturbing fact. Alexey Alexandrovitch was the only person who did not once look in that direction, and was not diverted from the interesting discussion he had entered upon. Noticing the disagreeable impression that was being made on everyone, Princess Betsy slipped someone else into her place to listen to Alexey Alexandrovitch, and went up to Anna. "I'm always amazed at the clearness and precision of your husband's language," she said. "The most transcendental ideas seem to be within my grasp when he's speaking." "Oh, yes," said Anna, radiant with a smile of happiness, and not understanding a word of what Betsy had said. She crossed over to the big table and took part in the general conversation. Alexey Alexandrovitch, after staying half an hour, went up to his wife and suggested that they should go home together. But she answered, not looking at him, that she was staying for supper. Alexey Alexandrovitch made his bows and withdrew. Madame Karenina's fat old coachman was with difficulty holding one of her pair of greys, chilled with the cold and rearing at the entrance. A footman stood opening the carriage door. The hall porter stood holding open the great door of the house. Anna Arkadyevna, with her quick little hand, was unfastening the lace of her sleeve, caught in the hook of her fur cloak, and with bent head listening to the words Vronsky murmured as he escorted her down. "You've said nothing, of course, and I ask nothing," he was saying. "But you know that friendship's not what I want, that there's only one happiness in life for me, that word that you dislike so. Yes, love." "Love," she repeated slowly in an inner voice, and suddenly, at the very instant, she unhooked the lace, and she added, "Why I don't like the word is that it means too much to me, far more than you can understand." and she glanced into his face. "Farewell." She gave him her hand, and with her rapid, springy step she passed by the porter and vanished into the carriage. Her glance, the touch of her hand, had set him aflame. He kissed the palm of his hand where she had touched it, and went home, happy in the sense that he had got nearer to the attainment of his aims that evening than during the last 2 months. Chapter 8. Alexey Alexandrovitch had seen nothing striking or improper in the fact that his wife was sitting with Vronsky at a table apart, in eager conversation with him about something. But he noticed that to the rest of the party this appeared to be something striking and improper, and for that reason it seemed to him, too, to be improper. He made up his mind that he must speak of it to his wife. On reaching home, Alexey Alexandrovitch went to his study, as he usually did, seated himself in his low chair, opened a book on the papacy at the place where he had laid the paper-knife in it, and read till 1 o'clock, as he usually did. But from time to time he rubbed his high forehead and shook his head, as though to drive something away. At his usual time he got up and made ready for the night. Anna Arkadyevna had not yet come in. With a book under his arm he went upstairs. But this evening, instead of his usual thoughts and meditations upon official details, his thoughts were absorbed by his wife, in something disagreeable connected with her. Contrary to his usual habit, he did not get into bed, but fell to walking up and down the rooms with his hands clasped behind his back. He could not go to bed, feeling it was absolutely needful for him to first think thoroughly over the position that had just arisen. When Alexey Alexandrovitch had made up his mind that he must talk to his wife about it, it had seemed a very easy and simple matter. But now, when he began to think over the question that had just presented itself, it seemed to him very complicated and difficult. Alexey Alexandrovitch was not jealous. Jealousy, according to his notions, was an insult to one's wife, and one ought to have confidence in one's wife. Why one ought to have confidence, that is to say, complete confidence that his young wife would always love him, he did not ask himself. But he had no experience of lack of confidence, because he had confidence in her, and told himself that he ought to have it. Now, though his conviction that jealousy was a shameful feeling and that one ought to feel confidence had not broken down, he felt that he was standing face to face with something illogical and irrational, and did not know what was to be done. Alexey Alexandrovitch was standing face to face with life, with the possibility of his wife loving someone other than himself, and this seemed to him very irrational and incomprehensible, because it was life itself. All his life Alexey Alexandrovitch had lived and worked in official spheres, having to do with the reflection of life, and every time he had stumbled against life itself, he had shrunk away from it. Now he experienced a feeling akin to that of a man who, while calmly crossing a precipice by a bridge, should suddenly discover that the bridge is broken, and that there is a chasm below. That chasm was life itself, the bridge, that artificial life in which Alexey Alexandrovitch had lived. For the first time the question presented itself to him of the possibility of his wife loving someone else, and he was horrified. He did not undress, but walked up and down with his regular tread over the resounding parquet of the dining room where one lamp was burning, over the carpet of the dark drawing-room in which the light was reflected on the big new portrait of himself hanging over the sofa, and across her boudoir, where 2 candles burned, lighting up the portraits of her parents and women friends, the pretty knickknacks of her writing-table, all that he knew so well. He walked across her boudoir to the bedroom door, and turned back again. At each turn in his walk, especially at the parquet of the lighted dining-room, he halted and said to himself, "Yes, this I must decide and put a stop to. I must express my view of it and my decision." And he turned back again. But express what? What decision? He said to himself in the drawing-room. And he found no reply. But after all, he asked himself before turning into the boudoir, what has occurred? Nothing. She was talking a long while with him, but what of that? Surely women in society can talk to whom they please, and jealousy means lowering both myself and her, he told himself as he went into her boudoir. But this dictum, which had always had such weight with him before, had now no weight and no meaning at all. And from the bedroom door he turned back again. But as he entered the dark drawing-room, some inner voice told him that it was not so, and that if others noticed it, that showed that there was something. And he said to himself again in the dining-room, "Yes, I must decide and put a stop to it and express my view of it." And again, at the turn in the drawing-room, he asked himself, "Decide how?" And again he asked himself, what had occurred? And answered, nothing, and recollected that jealousy was a feeling insulting to his wife. And again, in the drawing-room, he was convinced that something had happened. His thoughts, like his body, went round a complete circle without coming upon anything new. He noticed this, rubbed his forehead, and sat down in her boudoir. There, looking at her table, with the malachite blotting case lying at the top and an unfinished letter, his thoughts suddenly changed. He began to think of her, of what she was thinking and feeling. For the first time he pictured vividly to himself her personal life, her ideas, her desires, and the idea that she could and should have a separate life of her own seemed to him so alarming that he made haste to dispel it. It was a chasm in which he was afraid to peep into. To put himself in thought and feeling in another person's place was a spiritual exercise not natural to Alexey Alexandrovitch. He looked on this spiritual exercise as a harmful and dangerous abuse of the imagination. And the worst of it all, thought he, is that just now, at the very moment when my great work is approaching completion, he was thinking of the project he was bringing forward at the time, when I stand in need of all my mental peace and all my energies, just now this stupid worry should fall foul of me. But what's to be done? I'm not one of those men who submit to uneasiness and worry without having the force of character to face them. I must think it over, come to a decision, and put it out of my mind, he said aloud. The question of her feelings, of what has passed, and may be passing in her soul, that's not my affair. That's the affair of her conscience, and falls under the head of religion, he said to himself, feeling consolation in the sense that he had found to which division of regulating principles this new circumstance could properly be referred. And so, Alexey Alexandrovitch said to himself, questions as to her feelings, and so on, are questions for her conscience, with which I can have nothing to do. My duty is clearly defined. As the head of the family, I am a person bound in duty to guide her, and consequently, in part, the person responsible. I am bound to point out the danger I perceive, to warn her, even to use my authority. I ought to speak plainly to her. And everything that he would say tonight to his wife took clear shape in Alexey Alexandrovitch's head. Thinking over what he would say, he somewhat regretted that he should have to use his time and mental powers for domestic consumption with so little to show for it, but in spite of that, the form and contents of the speech before him shaped itself as clearly and distinctly in his head as a ministerial report. I must say and express fully the following points. First, exposition of the value to be attached to public opinion and to decorum. Secondly, exposition of religious significance of marriage. Thirdly, if need be, reference to the calamity possibly ensuing to our son. Fourthly, reference to the unhappiness likely to result to herself. And, interlacing his fingers, Alexey Alexandrovitch stretched them, and the joints of his fingers cracked. This trick, a bad habit, the cracking of his fingers, always soothed him, and gave precision to his thoughts, so needful to him at this juncture. There was the sound of a carriage driving up to the front door. Alexey Alexandrovitch halted in the middle of the room. A woman's step was heard mounting the stairs. Alexey Alexandrovitch, ready for his speech, stood compressing his crossed fingers, waiting to see if the crack would not come again. One joint cracked. Already, from the sound of light steps on the stairs, he was aware that she was close, and though he was satisfied with his speech, he felt frightened of the explanation confronting him. Chapter 9. Anna came in with hanging head, playing with the tassels of her hood. Her face was brilliant and glowing, but this glow was not one of brightness. It suggested the fearful glow of a conflagration in the midst of a dark night. On seeing her husband, Anna raised her head and smiled, as though she had just waked up. "You're not in bed? What a wonder," she said, letting fall her hood, and without stopping she went on into the dressing-room. "It's late, Alexey Alexandrovitch," she said, when she had gone through the doorway. "Anna, it's necessary for me to have a talk with you." "With me?" she said, wonderingly. She came out from behind the door of the dressing-room and looked at him. "Why, what is it? What about?" she asked, sitting down. "Well, let's talk if it's so necessary, but it would be better to get to sleep." Anna said what came to her lips, and hearing herself, she marveled at her own capacity for lying. How simple and natural her words were, and how likely that she was simply sleepy. She felt herself clad in an impenetrable armor of falsehood. She felt that some unseen force had come to her aid and was supporting her. "Anna, I must warn you," he began. Warn me of what? She said. She looked at him so simply, so brightly, that anyone that did not know her as her husband knew her could not have noticed anything unnatural, either in the sound or the sense of her words. But to him, knowing her, knowing that whenever he went to bed 5 minutes later than usual, she noticed it and asked him the reason. To him, knowing that every joy, every pleasure, and every pain that she felt, she communicated to him at once. To him, now to see that she did not care to notice his state of mind, that she did not care to say a word about herself, meant a great deal. He saw that the inmost recesses of her soul, that had always hitherto lain open before him, were closed against him. More than that, he saw from her tone that she was not even perturbed at that, but, as it were, said it straight out to him. Yes, it is shut up, and so it must be, and will be in the future. Now he experienced a feeling such as a man might have returning home and finding his own house locked up. But perhaps the key may yet be found, thought Alexey Alexandrovitch. I want to warn you, he said in a low voice, that through thoughtlessness and lack of caution you may cause yourself to be talked about in society. Your too animated conversation this evening with Count Vronsky, he enunciated the name firmly with deliberate emphasis, attracted attention. As he talked, he looked at her laughing eyes, which frightened him now with their impenetrable look, and as he talked, he felt all the uselessness and idleness of his words. "You're always like that," she answered, as though completely misunderstanding him, and of all he had said only taking in the last phrase. "One time you don't like my being dull, and another time you don't like my being lively. I wasn't dull tonight. Does that offend you?" Alexey Alexandrovitch shivered and bent his hands to make the joints crack. "Oh, please don't do that. I so dislike it," she said. "Anna, is this you?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch, quietly making an effort over himself and restraining the motion of his fingers. "But what is this all about?" she said, with such genuine and droll wonder. "What do you want of me?" Alexey Alexandrovitch paused and rubbed his forehead and his eyes. He saw that instead of doing as he had intended, that is to say, warning his wife against a mistake in the eyes of the world, he had unconsciously become agitated over what was the affair of her conscience, and was struggling against the barrier he fancied between them. "This is what I meant to say to you," he went on coldly and composedly, "and I beg you to listen to it. I consider jealousy, as you know, a humiliating and degrading feeling, and I shall never allow myself to be influenced by it. But there are certain rules of decorum which cannot be disregarded with impunity. This evening it was not that I observed it, but judging by the impression made on the company, everyone observed that your conduct and deportment were not altogether what could be desired." "I positively don't understand," said Anna, shrugging her shoulders. He doesn't care, she thought. But other people noticed it, and that's what upsets him. You're not well, Alexey Alexandrovitch, she said, and she got up and would have gone towards the door, but he moved forward as though he would stop her. His face was ugly and forbidding, as Anna had never seen him. She stopped, and bending her head back and on one side, began with her rapid hand taking out her hairpins. Well, I'm listening to what's to come, she said, calmly and ironically, and indeed I listen with interest, for I should like to understand what's the matter. She spoke and marveled at the confident, calm, and natural tone in which she was speaking, and the choice of the words she used. To enter into all the details of your feelings, I have no right, and besides, I regard that as useless and even harmful, began Alexey Alexandrovitch. Ferreting in one's soul, one often ferrets out something that might have lain there unnoticed. Your feelings are an affair of your own conscience, but I am in duty bound to you, to myself, and to God to point out to you your duties. Our life has been joined, not by man, but by God. That union can only be severed by a crime, and a crime of that nature brings its own chastisement. I simply don't understand a word. Oh dear, how sleepy I am, unluckily, she said, rapidly passing her hand through her hair, feeling for remaining hairpins. Anna, for God's sake, don't speak to me like that, he said gently. Perhaps I am mistaken, but believe me, what I say as much for myself as for you. I am your husband, and I love you. For an instant her face fell, and the mocking gleam in her eyes died away. But the word love threw her into revolt again. Love. Can he love? If he hadn't heard there was such a thing as love, he would never have even used the word. He doesn't even know what love is. Alexey Alexandrovitch, really, I don't understand, she said. Define what it is that you find. Pardon. Let me say all that I have to say. I love you. But I am not speaking of myself. The most important persons in this matter are our son and yourself. It may very well be, I repeat, that my words seem to you utterly unnecessary and out of place. It may be that they are called forth by my mistaken impression. In that case, I beg you to forgive me. But if you are conscious yourself of even the smallest foundation for them, then I beg you to think a little, and if your heart prompts you, to speak out to me. Alexey Alexandrovitch was unconsciously saying something utterly unlike what he had prepared. I have nothing to say, and besides, she said hurriedly, with difficulty repressing a smile, it really is time to be in bed. Alexey Alexandrovitch sighed, and without saying more, he went into the bedroom. When she came into the bedroom, he was already in bed. His lips were sternly compressed, and his eyes looked away from her. Anna got into her bed and lay expecting every minute that he would speak to her again. She both feared his speaking and wished for it, but he was silent. She waited for a long while without moving, and had forgotten all about him. She thought of the other. She pictured him and felt now how her heart was flooded with emotion and guilty delight at the thought of him. Suddenly she heard an even, tranquil snore. For the first instant, Alexey Alexandrovitch seemed, as it were, appalled at his own snoring, and ceased. But after an interval of 2 breathings, the snore sounded again with a new tranquil rhythm. "It's late, she whispered with a smile. A long while she lay, not moving, with open eyes, whose brilliance she almost fancied she could herself see in the darkness. Chapter 10. From that time a new life began for Alexey Alexandrovitch and for his wife. Nothing special happened. Anna went out into society, as she had always done, was particularly often at Princess Betsy's, and met Vronsky everywhere. Alexey Alexandrovitch saw this, but could do nothing. All his efforts to draw her into open discussion she confronted with a barrier which he could not penetrate, made up of a sort of amused perplexity. Outwardly everything was the same, but their inner relations were completely changed. Alexey Alexandrovitch, a man of great power in the world of politics, felt himself helpless in this. Like an ox with head bent, submissively he awaited the blow which he felt was lifted over him. Every time he began to think about it, he felt that he must try once more, that by kindness, tenderness, and persuasion there was still hope of saving her, of bringing her back to herself, and every day he made ready to talk to her. But every time he began talking to her, he felt that the spirit of evil and deceit which had taken possession of her had possession of him too, and he talked to her in a tone quite unlike that in which he had meant to talk. Involuntarily he talked to her in his habitual tone of jeering at anyone who should say what he was saying, and in that tone it was impossible to say what needed to be said to her. Chapter 11. That which for Vronsky had been for almost a whole year the one absorbing desire of his life, replacing all his old desires, that which for Anna had been an impossible, terrible, and even for that reason more entrancing dream of bliss, that desire had been fulfilled. He stood before her, pale, his lower jaw quivering, and he besought her to be calm, not knowing how or why. "Anna, Anna, Anna," he said with a choking voice. "Anna, for pity's sake." But the louder he spoke, the lower she dropped, her once proud and gay, now shame-stricken head. She bowed down and sank from the sofa where she was sitting, down on the floor at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet if he had not held her. "My God, forgive me," she said, sobbing, pressing his hands to her bosom. She felt so sinful, so guilty, that nothing was left her but to humiliate herself and beg forgiveness, and as now there was no one in her life but him, to him she addressed her prayer for forgiveness. Looking at him, she had a physical sense of her humiliation, and she could say nothing more. He felt what a murderer must feel when he sees the body he has robbed of life. That body, robbed by him of life, was their love, the first stage of their love. There was something awful and revolting in the memory of what had been bought at this fearful price of shame. Shame at their spiritual nakedness crushed her and infected him. But in spite of all the murderer's horror before the body of his victim, he must hack it to pieces, hide the body. He must use what he had gained by the murder. And with fury, as it were with passion, the murderer will fall upon the body and drag it and hack at it. So he covered her face and shoulder with kisses. She held his hand and did not stir. Yes, these kisses. That is what has been bought by this shame. Yes, in one hand, which will always be mine, the hand of my accomplice. She lifted up that hand and kissed it. He sank on his knees and tried to see her face, but she hid it and said nothing. At last, as though making an effort over herself, she got up and pushed him away. Her face was still as beautiful, but it was only the more pitiful for that. All is over, she said. I have nothing but you. Remember that. I can never forget what is my whole life for one instant of this happiness. Happiness, she said with horror and loathing, and her horror unconsciously infected him. For pity's sake, not a word more. She rose quickly and moved away from him. Not a word more, she repeated, and with a look of chill despair, incomprehensible to him, she parted from him. She felt that at that moment she could not put into words the sense of shame, of rapture, and of horror at this stepping into a new life, and she did not want to speak of it, to vulgarize this feeling by inappropriate words. But later, too, in the next day, and the third day, she still found no words in which she could express the complexity of her feelings. Indeed, she could not even find thoughts in which she could clearly think out all that was in her soul. She said to herself, "No, just now I can't think of it. Later, when I am calmer." But this calm for thought never came. Every time the thought rose of what she had done, and what would happen to her, and what she ought to do, a horror came over her, and she drove those thoughts away. Later, she said, when I am calmer. But in dreams, when she had no control over her thoughts, her position presented itself to her in all its hideous nakedness. One dream haunted her almost every night. She dreamed that both were her husbands at once, that both were lavishing caresses on her. Alexey Alexandrovitch was weeping, kissing her hands, and saying, "How happy we are now." And Alexey Vronsky was there too, and he too was her husband. And she was marveling that it had once seemed impossible to her, was explaining to them, laughing, that this was ever so much simpler, and that now both of them were happy and contented. But this dream weighed on her like a nightmare, and she awoke from it in terror.